Welcome to a Rice University podcast. For more information about us, please visit our website at www.rice.edu.
Good afternoon, everyone. Glad to see you all here. I am Susan McIntosh, and the director of Scientia. And we're very excited by our series on biopolitics this year. It's devoted to considering a variety of intersections of the life sciences with morality, ethics, policy, politics, and law. And certainly one of the most significant of these concerns the implications of neuroscience research on cognition and behavior for traditional notions of legal responsibility. Our speaker today poses the question in his abstract: if most behaviors are driven by systems of the brain that we cannot control, how should the law assess responsibility? And it is a question with such far-reaching consequences that it's no surprise that it has been the focus of some major funding efforts in the recent past for projects known, I think, sort of collectively by the shorthand neuro-law. The MacArthur Foundation, for example, last year unveiled its Law and Neuroscience project aimed at tackling issues including free will and responsibility, justification of punishment and treatment, truthful testimony, privacy of thought and intention, among other compelling topics. So this is quite a new frontier, and we are indeed fortunate to have one of the significant contributors to this pioneering field as our speaker today. Now, before I introduced David Eagleman, I just want to squeeze in mention of a couple of upcoming Scientia events. I'm going to mention this first one again at the end because I'm going to give you a chance to, if you are inclined, to sign up for it. But in connection with today's lecture, in which you will hear about the role of FMRI, or functional magnetic resonance imaging, in recent neuroscience advances, one of our Scientia student CP Snow fellows, Tommy Sprague, who works in Dr. Eagleman's lab, has arranged for a tour of the lab, including observing an fMRI scan in progress, I think on one of the participants, if I am not mistaken. So this is going to take place on November 7th at 4 in the afternoon, and we're going to have a sign-up sheet up here afterwards for those who are interested. We have a limit, I think we have a limitation of about 20 people for this, but you'll sign up and then we will get in touch with you. So I'll mention this again at the end. And hope that you'll be excited about this possibility of visiting a lab if you haven't seen fMRI in action or aren't so familiar with it. And then another upcoming event that we have on November 4th is the next Table Talk lecture. Vicki Colvin, professor of chemistry and biomolecular engineering and director of CBEN, the Center for Biology and Environmental Nanotechnology, will be talking in a very informal setting at Cohen House upstairs on her work over lunch, and it's an opportunity for people, unfortunately only those with Cohen House accounts, but basically for faculty and staff to get to know one another better and learn about what our colleagues are doing in their work in an informal setting. So we invite you to come to that as well. Now, on to our speaker. David Eagleman earned his undergraduate degree in British and American literature right here at Rice University and got his PhD in neuroscience at Baylor College of Medicine. After a postdoctoral fellowship at the Salk Institute for Biological Studies, he returned to Houston in 2003. He's on the faculty in the departments of neuroscience and psychiatry at Baylor College of Medicine, and he holds an adjunct appointment in the psychology department here at Rice, where he teaches biopsychology every year. Eagleman directs the Laboratory for Perception and Action at Baylor College of Medicine and is the founder and director of BCM's Initiative on Neuroscience and Law, which you can see referenced up there, which studies how new discoveries in neuroscience should navigate the way we make laws, punish criminals, and develop rehabilitation. The initiative recently organized a conference on neuroscience and law back in May, which drew an attendance of 300. Dr. Eagleman has published over 30 articles on the perception of real and illusory motion, human time perception and its illusions, mental imagery, and calcium dynamics in neural tissue in major journals, including Nature, Nature Neuroscience, Science, Public Library of Science 1, Journal of Neuroscience, and Neuron. He serves on the editorial boards of the Journal of Vision and Public Library of Science 1. He is also the author or co-author of 4 upcoming neuroscience books: Dethronement, The Secret Life of the Unconscious Brain, to be published by Pantheon; Wednesday is Indigo Blue, Discovering the Brain of Synesthesia, MIT Press, and 2 books on the brain for Oxford University Press. His scientific discoveries have been featured on the Discovery Channel, History Channel, BBC, ABC, and PBS, as well as in Discover Magazine, Scientific American, Seed Magazine, and New Scientist. So we are extremely lucky to have him lecturing for us today. Please help me in welcoming David Eagleman.
It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you for inviting me here. I noticed on the website just before it said that I'm the director of the departments of neuroscience and psychiatry. It turns out I'm not. I'm just an assistant professor there. But I am the director of the Initiative on Neuroscience and Law at Baylor College of Medicine. And we have now collected a great group of people, all of whom are interested in these fundamental questions about how do we understand criminal behavior? How can we predict it? How can we understand it? How might we solve it? What is the biology behind it? So what I'm going to try to give you guys today is an overview of what the major questions are and how we're going about moving forward on those questions. So we're going to start with the real stuff, which is the human brain. So this is the most complicated device that we found in the universe. It weighs about 3 pounds. It has, just in the cortex, just in the outer part, it's got about 10 billion neurons. And what that's an extraordinary number. Each neuron is connected to about 10,000 others, which means you have trillions of connections in the brain. So if you were to take just a cubic millimeter of neural tissue, you have more connections in there than you have stars in the Milky Way galaxy. So we're talking about an extremely complicated system. It's one that we don't understand. We're just scratching the surface of it. But what we do know is that somehow this biology determines who you are. These 3 pounds is equivalent to all your hopes and dreams and aspirations, the way you think, the way you act, what you believe, all these things. Now, why would we think that? It's because if you took, let's say you had a terrible accident and you lost part of your pinky, that wouldn't change you. You'd still fundamentally be the same person you were. But if you lose an equivalent little portion of your brain of about that size, that can change you entirely. It makes you a different person. It means that your capacity for decision making has changed, your executive function, your ability to understand music, your ability to name fuzzy animals, your ability to see color, all these things can be changed by damaging just a little part of your brain. Whereas if you damage other parts of your body, like your liver or your spleen, that doesn't happen. That's how we know that you are your brain. So that's the viewpoint of modern biology and essentially the launching point for everything we do. Now, if you go across the street to Baylor College of Medicine, what you'll see is that there are many levels at which we study neuroscience. So there are entire laboratories that are devoted to understanding what's happening at the molecular level with synaptic transmission and what happens at the level of a single synapse where it's essentially as complicated as a factory. There are whole labs devoted to understanding neurons. Neurons are the cells of the brain. They're cells just like every other cell in your body, except that they're a little bit specialized. They have these processes coming off of them. A single neuron in your brain is about as complicated as the city of Houston. It has the entire human genome in it. It's trafficking millions of proteins. It's made up of a fantastic scaffolding of proteins. So it's secreting, it's receiving signals. So it's a tremendously complicated structure, and then that's why it's really hard when we start studying networks of these, of tens of thousands of neurons. People move up from there to study regions of the brain using neuroimaging technologies. And then, of course, the goal is to figure out how all this wetware, all the wet biological gushy stuff maps onto the way you actually perceive the world and the way you actually behave. And as I said, what we're pretty sure of at this point is that there's an equivalence between all the wetware and who you are. Okay, so the modern view of neuroscience is that you are your brain. When did we start thinking this? Well, most of you probably know the story of Phineas Gage. How many people know Phineas Gage, right? It's a very common story right now. The reason it's an extraordinary story that everybody knows is because when Phineas Gage got this tamping rod exploding through his head, he didn't die. And he didn't even lose consciousness, which was really a surprise. The thing that happened, for those of you who don't know the story, is that his personality changed entirely. So he lost a big chunk of his brain in the frontal lobes, and people who knew him said, Phineas Gage is no longer Phineas Gage, he's someone else now. So he went from being a very sweet and happy person to being someone who was cussing and taking up with prostitutes and became a compulsive gambler. And his personality changed entirely after this brain damage. So this was one of the first clear cases in the medical literature showing that who you are and how you behave is a function of what's going on with your biology. Well, since then, we've had many, many more cases like this that all illustrate the same point. So here's who recognizes this person? Charles Whitman. Okay, so some people know who Charles Whitman in 1966 killed his mother and his wife, and then the next morning climbed up on the tower at the University of Texas at Austin campus with a trunk full of guns and ammunition and knives and food, and started shooting people from the top of the tower. And in total, he killed 14 people. And the entire Austin police force was rallied to the scene, and 4 of them finally got to the top and were able to kill him. The reason that what happened with Charles Whitman was such a surprise, it was such a surprise because here was a guy who was an Eagle Scout. He then went to the Marines. He was married. He held a good job in a bank. There was nothing about this guy's resume that would have indicated that he would climb to the top of a tower and start shooting people. So what happened? Well, after he killed his wife and his mother, he sat down at the typewriter and he wrote a long suicide note. And among other things, he said, I feel like I've been changing lately. Something's been happening to me. And when I die, when this is all over, I want you to do an autopsy. And they did do an autopsy on his brain after his death. And they found that he had a brain tumor. And this tumor was pressing on a part of his brain called the amygdala, which is an area that's involved in fear and aggression. So, not everybody who gets an amygdala tumor ends up becoming a sniper. But the question is, did it have something to do with this change in behavior? And the answer is almost certainly yes. Here's a more recent case. This was just reported in the literature. 40-year-old man who had a normal sexual appetite. And what happened is he started becoming a pedophile. So his behavior changed over a short period of time. He became very interested in child pornography. And his wife, who had known him for a long time, knew something was wrong. She took him to the doctor. They did scans, and it turned out that he had a massive frontal lobe tumor. So here's the side of his brain here. There's a tumor here. If you're looking down from the top, there's this giant mass in his brain. So it was pressing on his frontal lobes, and so the surgeons resected the tumor, and his sexual behavior went completely back to normal. What happened was 6 months later, he started showing signs of pedophilia again. So his wife took him back to the surgeons, and they realized that they had not gotten it all. And so they scooped out the rest of the tumor, and then his behavior returned once again to normal. So it's a really clear-cut case where you can see that his biology was affecting who he was and his behavior, in this case, criminal behavior. Okay, and of course we know that things like alcohol can affect your behavior. This is universally administered by people who want to be funny at parties and so on, and it causes them to, it causes you to make different decisions, right? This is of course true of all kinds of illegal narcotics, which are also administered universally. I list steroids here because does anyone recognize this guy? Chris Benoit. So he was a professional wrestler who somehow got his physician to assign to him giant amounts of testosterone, and he ended up committing suicide after killing his wife and his son at home. It was a mass killing. And the interpretation, even though it's difficult to know for sure, the interpretation is that it was a roid rage. It turns out that even medications that are prescribed by physicians can change your behavior entirely. So some of you may know about these Parkinson's medications that now come with warnings on the side of the bottle that says may lead to compulsive gambling. And this is because Parkinson's is involved with a neurotransmitter called dopamine, and so you essentially want to raise the dopamine levels in Parkinson's patients. But this neurotransmitter is also involved in your appetite for risk. And so it turns out that when you raise the dopamine levels, people go from being risk averse to really wanting risk. And so these very sweet elderly patients who get on this Parkinson's medication end up changing their personality entirely and going and blowing their family's money in Las Vegas. This is what's been happening with these Parkinson's meds. So what does this indicate? Again, it's that you are your biology. So if you start moving the levels around, that changes your behavior. So nowadays, when we talk about morality and we talk about decision making, really what we're talking about is the neural basis of it. We're talking about how what's going on in your brain determines this. Okay, well what this comes down to is this question of free will then. So if you are your biology, if the mind is not separate from the brain, but if instead they're the same, what does this mean for the legal system? How should the legal system deal with the fact that when you do something, the question of culpability, like to what extent is it your fault versus your biology's fault? What if that's actually the wrong question to ask? So I'll try to expand on this here. First of all, there's an issue of importance to me. This is the subject of my book, Dethronement. It's about the unconscious brain. It turns out that just about everything you think and do and act and believe is generated by parts of your brain that you have no access to, and you're not even well acquainted with. So everything that's dear to you, your instincts, the way you act, your notion of who is beautiful and who's not, your notions of who you're attached to, the way you choose to behave, as much as we like to believe that we're the ones driving the boat, in fact, most of what's going on is generated by parts of your brain that make decisions, give you intuitions, give you hunches, and then serve that up to you. So just as an example, there was a study where they had men look at photographs of women's faces and judge the attractiveness of the women. And in one set of the photos, the women's eyes were dilated just a little bit with a little neosinephrine. So the men judge the women with dilated eyes as being more attractive. But they have no conscious access to that, right? This is because a woman's eyes become more dilated when she's sexually excited. But the men who were doing these judgments had no ability to say, oh yeah, I noticed that her pupil was a millimeter bigger in this picture than in this. But their brains picked up on it, right? Well, this is how most of your life goes. Your brain's picking up on things, working behind the scenes, 100% of the time, full tilt, and then every once in a while you say, oh, I just had an idea. But it wasn't you that had the idea, it was the rest of your brain. Okay, so when it comes to this very deep question about free will, people have been arguing about this for a long time, and the suggestion that I'm making is that we can actually circumvent it. I don't know whether we have a little bit of free will riding on top or not. But if we do, it's the smallest part of what's going on in the brain. So what I'm suggesting is the law of sufficient automatism, which is that enough of our drives and behaviors are inaccessible to us that for the legal system, we can go ahead and ignore the possibility of a little bit of free will riding on top, whether or not it happens. Now this is my suggestion. In the Q&A session we can wrestle about this. But the idea is that most of what your conscious brain is the smallest part of what's going on in the brain. And so, and automatism, by the way, for the legal system is if you do something that's automatic, then you're not considered culpable for that. So for example, if I have Huntington's chorea and that causes my arm to move like that, and I hit somebody and they fall off a cliff, I'm not responsible for that in the eyes of the law because it's called an automatism. I wasn't involved with that. So what I'm saying is that we are sufficiently like automaton. Okay, so the big question is, what does all this mean for the notion of culpability? Well, here's where the tension comes in between the legal system and what we know in biology. The legal system rests on the assumption that we're all practical reasoners, meaning we're free to choose how we act, and not only that, but that we all have the same capacity for decision making and making sort of rational decisions. Okay, well, what we know is that modern neuroscience suggests you're not a practical reason at all. There's essentially no evidence that you're free in some fundamental way to choose how you're acting. Instead, you are subject to the biology that you're born with, the genes you're born with, the experiences that you've had. And so, and not only that, but along any axis that you measure, there's a real big distribution in the human population in terms of capacities and decision making and risk averseness and so on. So that's where the tension comes in between what the legal system would like to believe and what modern neuroscience suggests. Okay, one thing I want to emphasize is this. When we talk about why we want to understand the biological basis of how people behave, Some people worry that maybe if you explain criminal behavior in terms of the biology, this would lead to letting people off, to exculpation. It's exactly the opposite. That's not at all the goal of this. Instead, the idea about understanding criminal behavior is so that we can do rational sentencing. So jail, in my view, is not a one-size-fits-all solution, and certainly not having the same sorts of sentencing guidelines for every criminal, because there are very different reasons why people commit crimes. We can also, for the first time in 100 years, really take seriously this idea of rehabilitation. So there hasn't been a new idea introduced for rehabilitation in a very long time. And in a little bit I'll suggest something that we're doing right now to try to introduce an entirely new method of thinking about rehabilitation. So instead of just throwing everybody into these repeated rounds of incarceration, the idea of understanding the biology of criminal behavior so that we can do something a little bit more enlightened as a legal system. Okay, and this was from Whitman's suicide note. He said, "If my life insurance policy is valid, please pay off my debts, donate the rest anonymously to a mental health foundation. Maybe research can prevent further tragedies of this type." Whitman was, I'll come back to this point, but he was incredibly insightful about what was going on with him. Okay, so one thing I want to make clear at the outset is how we actually do the science, how we move the science forward. So, as I said, we're starting with this notion that the brain and behavior, your biology gives you your behavior. But it's an extremely complicated system and not one that we understand fully. So how do we actually go about it, and how well do we understand it currently? So many of you are probably familiar with what's currently sort of the best method of neuroimaging. It's called MRI, magnetic resonance imaging. And essentially this is a giant magnet that we put people in here, and by aligning protons in your tissue with the magnetic field and then pulsing them in the right way, we can actually get signals off of these and get anatomical snapshots of what's going on. So what you get with magnetic resonance imaging is an ability to actually peer inside the skull and see what's going on with the anatomy. And so what you can do is you can actually find out if there are gross structural abnormalities in somebody's brain this way. You're actually peeking inside the system. It's an incredible technology. Now, I dropped a slide here. What we have now is what's called FMRI, which is functional magnetic resonance imaging. And what that allows you to do is eavesdrop where the blood flow is going. And where the blood flow is a proxy for where neural activity just was. So essentially what we can find out is where is the major activity in the brain at any given moment by every couple of seconds monitoring where the blood flow is going. Okay, and so these are extraordinary technologies in the sense that for the first time we can look in and we can see all sorts of things. In 1966, when Charles Whitman had a tumor in his head, we didn't have any ability to look inside people's heads until after they'd died. So that's the good news. The bad news is it's a little limited, our technology still, our knowledge of what's going on. So the analogy that I'm using in my book Dethronement is if you were a space shuttle astronaut and you were in orbit over the United States looking down, what would you actually be able to see about the United States? Well, you would be able to tell if there were massive forest fires going on in California. But you wouldn't be able to tell more subtle things, like if Washington Mutual Bank just went under and was bought by Chase or something like that. You wouldn't be able to see that from your perspective way up there. And that's sort of our situation with fMRI, is that we can't see more than big, gross anatomical issues in the brain. And as a footnote, this can, as this moves into courtrooms increasingly, put undue pressure on neuroscientists to say more, to conclude more than they're actually able to from the technology. So hopefully people will be careful about this and not assume they can say much more. But the problem is this technology has crept into the public consciousness. Last time I was at my parents' house, I saw this sitting on the counter. What makes this good and evil? So there's a spot pointing to Hitler here and a spot pointing to Gandhi. And this is completely ridiculous. There's no ability that we have to look in the brain with the fanciest of technologies and be able to tell if you're Hitler or Gandhi. The brains look the same, because all of the interesting stuff that happens in neuroscience is at a more subtle level. It's at the level of the microcircuitry. It's at the level of how the brains are wired up through their genes and through the experience that they've had, and that's what causes human behavior. And so currently, with the exception of very big problems that we can tell, like a tamping rod through the head, it's very hard to tell what the difference is between Hitler's brain and Gandhi's brain. Okay, does anyone know who Patricia Reggiani is? So she was the wife of the fashion heir Maurizio Gucci, and she had him murdered. So she went to court, was found guilty, then went back on appeal and said, you know, turns out I had a frontal lobe tumor, and we just found it now, but we think that at the time of the murder, it was growing, and that's what caused me to do this. Now, it was well known that she hated her husband and they had a bad relationship. So this is in court now, and it's an open question whether this is going to fly as a defense. But this sort of thing will be happening more and more, where people say, essentially, it wasn't me, it was my tumor, so I'm not the one culpable for it. And of course, we have many situations where we don't know anything about the criminal's brain. So this was Cho, the Virginia Tech shooter, and like most school shooters, he was killed at the end, and often they are shot in the head, and so we don't actually know anything about their biology. So, circling back around to this main question of how does our biological understanding reflect on how we think about the culpability question? One of my colleagues, Wolf Singer, made a very interesting suggestion. He said, look, there's a lot of things we can't measure. So maybe the act of committing the crime is all the evidence you actually need for a brain abnormality. Now, this caused a lot of screaming and yelling when he suggested this, but it's an interesting thing that I think is worthy of consideration. So the idea is there are many things that we have no idea how to measure yet. So if we had Cho's brain and we looked at it carefully with our whole armamentarium of tools, would we be able to detect anything different? Maybe not with our current tools. But the act itself, what he did, is some sort of evidence that his brain is abnormal. And I should mention, all we mean by abnormal here, this is just a statistical statement. It just means, you know, here's the statistical distribution, and Cho's brain is over here. There's something different about his brain. And if you buy the idea that brain equals behavior, then you sort of have to buy this, that if somebody does a really abnormal act, there's something in the neural structure that is responsible for that. And I kind of think this view makes a little bit of sense, and here's why. So when you think about our ability to measure things, Phineas Gage might walk into the courtroom and we say, you poor guy, you had a tamping rod through your head, surely that counts as a mitigating factor. With a guy like Chris Benoit, you might say, okay, well, we understand that you were hopped up on testosterone and that changed your behavior. With drug addiction and crime in general, we understand that drugs rewire the brain. They reconfigure the circuitry of the brain. So maybe we give a little bit of credence to that. With somebody who comes in and claims that they had a brain tumor that was small at the time and unmeasurable, it's a little hard to know. And then by the time you get down to the common criminal who's standing in front of the judge's bench, we don't really know, we can't really measure much here. If we took this guy's brain and we measured it with everything we have, it's probably going to look about the same as ours, simply because our technology is a little bit crude, right? So the difficult situation we're in is that currently the way we all sort of think about it, the way we intuit it and the way the legal system treats it, is there's sort of a line here. And on one side of that line we say, okay, well, it's not really your fault, it's your biology. And on the other side we say, that's your fault. Okay, but the thing is, this line is determined by our current technology. And as our technologies get better and better, the line is going to creep to the left here. So the deep question is, does it make sense to have this line at all? Does it make sense to say, based on what we can measure, you're off or you're guilty? And my suggestion is going to be that maybe culpability is not the right question for us to be asking. Maybe instead of saying, to what extent is it your fault versus your biology's fault, maybe instead we should be saying, you know what? We don't care why you did it. All we're going to think about is what to do from here. All we're going to think about is how we're going to put you away for what length of time, whether there's any customized rehabilitation that we can do, and that's it. And we can drop this question of like the bloodlust and to what extent did you decide, and we instead just treat it as you've done this thing, the evidence clearly indicates that you've done it, so here's what we're going to do next. And I'll try to unpack that a little bit. But essentially that's the idea, I think, as we understand the biology of behavior, is to get rid of the culpability question altogether, because it just doesn't matter. Okay, So I've been mentioning culpability. I'm going to touch on a few other points here to try to unpack these a little bit. And we're going to get to the other half of the equation, which is the brains of the jurors who are sitting there making the decisions about punishment. Okay, so as far as rational sentencing goes, the view that I just mentioned about forward thinking is also known as the utilitarian view, which is you predicate the sentencing on the probability of recidivism, the probability that somebody's going to do it again. So that seems like a very enlightened idea to do it. And in fact, the legal system already does this to some degree. For example, with crimes of passion, if a wife kills her husband because she found him in bed with another woman, the court treats that differently because fundamentally it means that it's not the kind of thing she's going to do over and over. Whereas somebody who's a murderer who might do it again is treated very differently. So we already do this. But the question is, could we actually, is there any way that we can improve our ability to say who's going to do it again? So let's take as an example sex offenders. So when sex offenders are going out on parole, if you ask a psychiatrist or if you ask the parole board, what is the probability that they're going to do it again? They are terrible at it. They have no predictive capacity to say who's going to commit a crime again or not. So what people developed were these actuarial tests, where essentially it's a list of questions, and you're asking, were you abused as a child? Are you addicted to drugs? Have you ever been in a relationship for more than a year? A whole bunch of questions. They did this with 22,000 sex offenders and followed them out for 5 years and saw who committed crimes again and who didn't. And then they backwards correlated to see which are the important factors in predicting. So it turns out these actuarial tests are pretty good. They are the best sort of predictive tools that we have, and this is what's currently used by the courts in deciding sentencing for sex offenders. But the open, obvious question is, could we actually improve those tests by looking inside the skull? So that's what we're starting to move forward on right now. We're looking for neural signatures. Now, there's a bunch of things that we need to be really careful about here as far as identifying tendencies. First of all, we're never going to know with 100% certainty who's going to commit a crime. So we're not trying for that or claiming that. It's very important, of course, for a legal system to never fall in the trap or anywhere close of punishing for tendencies rather than actions. So it's not the case that this sort of knowledge is moving forward so that we can treat people differently. Instead, it's just so that you could predicate the sentencing on rational grounds. And of course, it's clear that behavior depends on context. So even if somebody has a high probability or a low probability, obviously the context matters for whether that crime is going to be committed. Now, happily, neuroscience is not the first field to run into these deep questions about how do we think about tendencies and predilections for the future. Genetics is 2 decades ahead of us on thinking about these questions. And I know that the previous speaker and 2 speakers from now are talking about genetic horoscopes and what, so there are a lot of these questions that have been wrestled with for a while about this. But if we're going to buy the idea in the first place that the sentencing should be based on some sort of probability of recidivism, then it makes sense to use the best tools we have to get there, to make the best sorts of predictions of recidivism. Okay. And one thing I want to emphasize is this doesn't just mean longer jail terms. Instead, what it could really mean is rehabilitation. So there hasn't been a really good new idea for rehabilitation introduced since the idea of the prefrontal lobotomy, which is sticking an ice pick in the orbit of somebody's eye and scrambling around the front part of their brains, which turned out to not be terribly useful and quite cruel and unusual. So we've got this fantastic science going on now, and the question is, as we understand better the neural basis of criminal behavior, is there anything that we can contribute here? Okay, so I'm going to tell you about the method that we're working on right now, but I have to back up one step and tell you the right way to think about the brain. So the legal system is always referring to the mind. And in fact, people in general, people on the street always refer to the mind. Like, well, what is, fundamentally, what's your desire? What is your mind telling you? Okay, well, it turns out there's a problem there, which is there's not just a single mind. Your brain is better understood as a representative democracy. You have a whole bunch of different parts of your brain that are always competing to control your behavior. And this is why you can cuss at yourself and get mad at yourself and argue with yourself and negotiate with your future self So if I put a piece of chocolate cake in front of you, some part of your brain says, I really want that chocolate cake, and I'm going to eat it. And another part of your brain says, don't do it. You're going to be fat tomorrow if you do it. And another part of your brain says, okay, I tell you what, I'll do it, and I'll go to the gym tomorrow. And then you have these negotiations, but they're all you. They're all different parts of your brain that are competing for control of the system. And the behavior in the end of a person has to do with how that battle tips, which way it goes, who wins. Okay, so that's what determines the outcome of the action. Well, given that, we're predicating a rehabilitative strategy on this, and we're using something. Here's one more quote from Whitman. He says, I don't quite understand what it is that compels me to type this letter. I don't really understand myself these days. I'm supposed to be an average, reasonable, and intelligent young man. However, lately, I can't recall when it started, I have been a victim of many unusual and irrational thoughts. So you can hear this conflict playing out within Whitman. Okay, here's what we're doing. We're taking advantage of this using a cutting-edge technology called neurofeedback. This is what we're doing across the street. So with neurofeedback, it's like biofeedback from the 70s. You guys remember this, where you put something on your hand and you visually see what's going on, and you're using that to try to control something about your biology. Well, neurofeedback is where we put somebody in the scanner, and we're imaging their brain, and in real time, we're analyzing that data and giving them some sort of visual feedback about what's going on in their brain. And they can use that visual feedback to try to modify their own brain activity. So here's the idea. The idea is for some subset of criminals, they actually know what the right thing to do is. They have some parts of their brain that can do the long-term decision making and say, you know what, I don't want to be doing this sort of behavior. But some parts of their brain, the impulsive parts, the instant gratification parts, those aren't being squelched properly. And so in the battle between the impulse and controlling that impulse, the impulse is winning. So the idea is what I'm calling taking them to the frontal lobe gym, where we strengthen up their frontal lobe and we allow the parts of their brain that care about long-term decision making to squelch the parts to control the parts of their brain that have that instant gratification need. So what I think is really wonderful about this, if it works, is that unlike other things like prefrontal lobotomy, we're not fundamentally changing the person. We're not doing anything to change the person. All we're doing is we're helping them to make better long-term decision making. And if internally they still have all sorts of deviant thoughts, but they don't act on them, that's fine. That's all we can ask for as a legal system, is that people don't act illegally on their thoughts. We're starting this with cigarette smokers, which is easier to pilot before we get into criminals. But the idea is that, so we show, just so you know how it works, what we do is we show people pictures that induce craving, and that allows us to measure the parts of their brain that are involved in that craving. And we can, on the fly, measure the activity in these networks, in these craving networks, and give them some sort of graphical representation of that. So for example, we show them this picture, and there's this red cigarette here. And what they're trying to do is surf through their mental space to figure out how to make this activity go down. And as they make it go down, the cigarette turns to white. And so their goal, as they're sitting there visually looking at this, is to make that cigarette turn white. And the way they do that is by reducing the activity in this craving network. So that's the idea of the frontal lobe gym. It doesn't change people. It just changes their capacity for rational decision making. And I think if that works, right now it's completely science fiction, but if it works in 6 months from now, I think it'll really change things a lot. Okay. So I'm going to switch gears now and just talk a few other points where neuroscience and law interact. One of them, of course, is the capacity to act. So under what circumstances do we say that somebody has the capacity to sign a contract, for example? If you have a patient with dementia who signs a contract for some new mortgage or some new investment vehicle, courts of law currently care about this and say, you know, in fact, all brains aren't the same. Now, in the view of the legal system, which likes bright lines, you either have capacity or you don't have capacity. In fact, the more realistic version is that there's a distribution of capacity, right? But nonetheless, they at least recognize two different categories. One thing that we deal with in the medical center all the time is the issue of patients signing medical consents. So you've got some terrible, painful terminal cancer, and you're asked, hey, do you want to do this new procedure, which is very high risk, and you may not live through it, but do you want to sign it? And we try to understand under what circumstances can people sign these sorts of consents. Now, something that people aren't really talking about, but within the normal population, within that distribution, when do we say that people have capacity? So if somebody signs a subprime mortgage contract, which is a very complicated contract with all sorts of loopholes and strange things in it, does everyone have the same capacity to understand? And the answer is clearly no. So there are all sorts of interesting issues to unpack there. We can come back to those at question time. So I want to switch gears again and talk about jurors' brains, which is the other half of the equation here. So the notion of retributivism is this idea that criminals deserve their just deserts. Desert here comes from the word deserve. So this is correct. Most people think that's incorrectly spelled, but that's the correct spelling of it. So there's been a lot of study on this sort of thing lately. Many of you may know about what's called altruistic punishment, which is if I see somebody cheating somebody else, I will actually give up my own resources to see that person get punished. That's called altruistic punishment. Why? Because we hate cheaters. We hate that stuff so much. We are hardwired for this. And this sort of thing has paid off well in the small evolutionary history that we've had, right? Okay, the question is, as a legal system, though, does it still make sense to base things on that? Or, as I mentioned before, would it make more sense, would it be more enlightened to base a system on utilitarianism? And in my view, the purpose of the legal system is to crystallize good ideas into place and sort of ride above the vagaries of human nature. So, as an example, we're also sort of hardwired with xenophobia. We don't really like people who don't look like us so much, right? But it turns out that the legal system says, you know what? You can't do housing discrimination. We're going to actually crystallize this into place that you have to sell your house to anyone who makes the proper offer. And I think that's the purpose of the legal system, is to crystallize into place our more enlightened views. So what we're doing right now is we're testing how individual jurors make decisions, what sorts of things they respond to in the case. For example, if there's more violence involved, if there's more personal contact involved, it turns out that people behave very differently than if it's a crime that's done sort of at a distance. And where we're moving in the near future is what's called hyperscanning. So this was a technology developed by my colleague Reed Montague, where you can have multiple people in multiple scanners, and they're all interacting with each other over video screens, and we're measuring all their brains at once. So what we're going to be doing is a mock jury of people interacting in the scanners. And remember, the mandate for a jury is actually the same as for your brain, which is you've got all these different subparts that are told to come to a single decision, which is what your brain is always doing. So we're actually going to treat these different brains like a mega brain and analyze what's happening there. So that's what we're doing in terms of juries. I just want to touch on a few other points. So everybody here who's ever taken a psychology class knows about the problem of eyewitness testimony. But this is a very highly educated group, and it turns out that most jurors, don't recognize this as a problem. So we know that memory is constructed and involves the expression of genes and proteins and sort of cementing things into place. It's constantly rewritten and reconstructed. As one author put it, memory is a myth-making machine, and we are constantly reinventing our past to keep it consistent with who we think we are. So memory is reconstructed. It's enormously fallible, but when you actually study populations, you find that most people believe the metaphor of a video recorder. They believe that's literally true. And even if you explain to jurors the data about the fallibility of eyewitness testimony, they'll still say, okay, fine, but I have a better than average memory. So it turns out that this is a real problem, and what the statistics suggest very clearly is that there's an unwarranted confidence in eyewitness testimony. So this is another area where neuroscience will continue to try to make a contribution. I'm just going to surf over 4 other areas where neuroscience touches on the law. So one of them is with lie detection. The reason I bring this up is because there have been several new technologies introduced just in the last few years about trying to detect when somebody is lying by using these new technologies. So instead of the polygraph test, people are using, for example, neuroimaging. So there were 2 new companies that started in California to detect lies. And there's this open question about whether this is going to be allowed into courts. So not only with FMRI, but also thermal measures, which is based on measuring the temperature under the orbits of somebody's eye, and then of course using electroencephalography, where you put electrodes on somebody's head. there are many problems with this. The fundamental one being, we don't have a very good understanding of what a lie is fundamentally. And so the same issues that plagued the polygraph test will plague these new technologies as well. And of course, there's always the problem that somebody could be telling the truth, but they're factually incorrect. So these are all issues. These are all going to be the main issues about introducing these things into courtrooms anytime soon. What just happened in India a few weeks ago was a man was convicted based on EEG lie detection, and that was the first time internationally that somebody's been convicted based on this sort of new lie detector technologies, and there's a big outcry about it, essentially about the probative value of the technology. Is it actually good enough that you could put somebody away for it? Bias detection. I'm sure many of you who've taken psychology classes know about bias detection. For those of you who don't, the idea is that in your unconscious brain, you've got all sorts of biases. You may be a racist in various ways. You may have phobias about certain groups of people, certain religions, things like that. And so there have been several groups that have claimed that you can actually tease this out by looking at people's reaction times. So the idea is, I give you this test, and I say, okay, I'm either going to flash a word on the screen, or I'm going to flash a picture on the screen, and if it's a bad word like war or death or murder, then I want you to hit the right button. And if it's a good word like rainbow or sunshine, then hit the left button. It might also be a picture. So if it's a picture of an African American, I want you to hit the left button, and if it's a European American, then hit the right button. So I flash a word like war, and you hit the right button. And then I flash happiness, so you hit the left button. And then I flash a face. And the question is, are you slowed down? Here's the idea. If you're a racist, then you're going over here to hit for African American, but the word good is associated over there, and the word bad is over here. And so you're actually slowed down just enough with your reaction times that you can tell if you're a racist. Okay, this is the claim. There's a lot of literature about this. There are some people who argue that maybe it's not a good test. But the question that's on the mind of neuro-law people is this going to be allowed into court? So let's say you're an employer and you fire someone, and the guy says, you fired me because I'm of this religion, or I'm gay, or I'm of this race. And you say, no, that had nothing to do with it. Could this be used in court where people say, look, fundamentally your unconscious brain is telling us X, Y, Z, and so now that's going to be used as part of the evidence. So this is an open question whether this sort of thing will creep into courtrooms. Okay, I'll just mention this, which is the issue of brain death. The whole issue, even though it's been worked on for a long time, there's still a tension there between the legal and the medical, because the legal system, which, as I said, likes bright lines, likes to say you're dead or you're not dead. But in fact, it's much more complicated than that with the biology. There's a lot of space in between dead and not dead. So whole parts of your brain can be knocked out by a stroke, and yet there are some parts of your brain that are still struggling along. And so the question is, at what point do you declare that somebody's actually dead? So there's a really interesting gray area in there, and I think there's a lot more work that's going to happen there. One thing that I'll just mention is a fantastic paper in 2005 where they looked at patients who were in persistent vegetative state. So these are patients who have not responded to stimuli, have not talked to their family, have not been conscious in the way that we think of consciousness for months or years. So they took a woman who was in a persistent vegetative state, and the question, of course, is, in all these cases is there anybody in there, right? I mean, is there something going on inside? Well, how do you find out? What they did is they took her and they put her in an MRI machine. And they asked her various questions. They said, I'd like you to picture playing tennis. And the areas of her brain that were involved in motor acts became active. And they said, we'd like you to picture walking around your house. And the parts of her brain involved in maps and moving became active. And things like this. So it was really an amazing finding. There's plenty of debate about exactly how to interpret it and whether that does mean she's conscious exactly. But it's a great start, because what it means is that we can actually peer inside people's heads and start making a little bit of progress using our new tools about whether somebody is dead or alive in some fundamental sense. And then, of course, of interest to Rice students is modifying the brain. Every few years in the neuroscience community, there's some buzz about that somebody's really invented a nootropic drug, meaning a smart drug, something that vastly enhances your intelligence, your attention span, things like this. Now, of course, we've got lots of little drugs like this, like caffeine, and some people smoke cigarettes and things like that. But in fact, what people talk about with nootropic drugs is, as we understand learning and memory better and better, can we really nail it? Can we really make a drug that makes you just remember everything in the textbook that you're reading? And at some point this is going to happen. And when it does, we're going to have exactly the same problems that we have with anabolic steroids in athletes, which is, some people are going to be using it and some people won't, and then that makes an uneven playing field. And you can imagine that when kids are taking the LSATs or the MCATs and they really want to perform well, they'll pay any amount of money to get a hold of these sorts of things. So this is an area where at some point we're going to run into troubles. Okay, so I've mentioned a whole bunch of contact points between neuroscience and law. But I think I can sort of divide these into different levels of their importance. There are some areas where we're merely going to contribute our knowledge to the legal system. We're going to say, look, here's what we're able to measure, and here's how the legal system might use it. I think there are other areas where it's going to be critical for neuroscience to raise its voice and say, fundamentally, the way that we think about human behavior needs a revamping. The idea that we're practical reasoners, and there's this myth of equality in the legal system, which is that we all have the same capacity to make these sorts of decisions. All of that stuff, at some point, is going to need to get jettisoned. And so I think it's important for neuroscience to raise its voice there. And then finally, there are other parts where we can really change the world. We can really improve the system by contributing new methods for rehabilitation, and then the legal system can take that and run with it. There are many different time scales on which these different things will happen. Lie detectors are already happening. We're working on this now, redefining brain death. All these things will happen. I put this with a broken line here, and it's not actually a joke. It turns out one of the fundamental things we're doing in neuroscience is trying to understand how the brain works and how you ever put together billions of neurons and get something out of it that's conscious, right? How do you put together all this wetware and get something that loves and laughs and lives and is, has hunger and anger and joy? Okay, so at some point, when we understand that, we're going to know that we understand it because we'll be able to build it. We'll be able to simulate a brain on a computer. And once we can do that and make a conscious simulation, then you have to worry about turning that off at night, because then that's murder, right? So that's going to be the future. And believe it or not, people are already writing about robot legislation, about protecting the rights of when we start creating conscious creatures. Okay, you know what? I'll do this. How much time do I have? Should I do this?
Do you need more than 5 minutes?
I do not need more than 5 minutes. I'll do this really fast, just because it's important. So Time magazine is so easy to make fun of because they always have the stupidest covers. So this is the idea of genetic determinism, and it's completely wrong. And Amy McGuire, who's going to speak here in 2 Scientias from now, this is her joke actually. She told me, she said, infidelity is not about what's in our genes, it's what's outside of your genes. That's what okay, so, but it turns out that this is an important thing to address because sometimes there's a little confusion about this. So what really, the current state of your brain comes from an interaction of genes and experience, right? So it's the genes that you're dealt and the experience that you have in life, these intertwine in very complex ways to give you your current brain that stands in front of the judge's bench there. And given your brain and the context you're in, that's what causes the behavior you have. And how you behave loops back into your experiences, and on a longer time scale, it loops back to whether you pass your genes on or not. So there's this very complicated interaction, and I think that the new science of gene-environment interactions is extremely important to understand. So I'm just going to mention this in closing. So here's just an example. Are there genes for depression? Well, yes and no. It depends on what happens in your life. So for example, what they do is they take the number of stressful life events that you've had. So you had some really terrible car accident, or maybe you had a car accident plus your house burned down, or maybe that happened and your sibling died, or, right? People have different numbers of really terrible things that happen in their life. Well, it turns out that depending on the flavor of the genes they're carrying, I'm going to skip the details here, but depending on what you're carrying, if only one stressful thing happens, there's really no difference. Like, you may or may not become depressed. That's what's on the y-axis, is the probability that you're going to present with a major depressive episode. But with the more terrible things, these separate out, and you're more likely to have a depressive episode given the exact same circumstances based on the genes that you're carrying. So this is just a really nice example of how people are going about studying gene-environment interactions. As another example, happens to be from the same group, which is, how does child abuse go? Are you going to become an abuser if you were abused? The thing that's confused sociologists for a long time is that happens a lot, but it doesn't happen with everybody, just some people. So it turns out that given another gene, depending on the level of childhood maltreatment you had, I'm sorry, here it shows up better here with this line. So you might have no childhood or probable or severe maltreatment. Depending on the gene you're carrying, this determines your probability of becoming antisocial yourself and presumably passing that on to your children. So I just want to emphasize that. And there are a lot of environmental pathogens that can happen that can change your behavior. And I just want to, actually it's silly for me to close with such a silly example, but I just thought this was an interesting example because there will be many more things like this, which is a lot of people have discussed why crime started to fall in the early 1990s. Nobody predicted that. Crime was going up and up and up, and then all of a sudden it started to fall precipitously. And one speculation has been that this has to do with the Clean Air Act. Now, this sounds crazy, but it turns out that if you have lead in your blood, it's now pretty well known that this causes brain damage and it causes more aggression in children as they become adults too. Well, what happened is when the Clean Air Act got passed, it absolutely lowered the levels of lead in the air that all of us breathe precipitously. And so it's been suggested, that this was the reason why crime fell. Now, there's a lot of debate. It may be right, it may be wrong, but it's at least on the right track of trying to think about the interactions between our brains and our behavior, and even how our legislation on a large scale affects that. So that's all I'm going to say. I'll just add one more thing, which is I'm sure all of you are wondering how you can be involved, and I'm glad you asked. One thing that we do is every year have a conference on neuroscience and law in May, so that's coming up in half a year from now, and I hope that you guys will keep an eye on that if you're interested in going, and that's it. I'll take questions.
I know you all have a lot of questions. Just wait for a microphone to get you because we're taping this and we won't be able to hear your question unless you have a microphone. So you want to call on people and we have runners who will take the microphones.
Sure. Question over here.
Okay, so I have a whole lot of questions. I'll try to choose just one. So there's an observation I made throughout your talk. I'm a computer science guy, so I noticed often you would say things like the brain is behavior, the brain is personality, that these two are the same thing. And then usually afterwards you'd say, and personality is a function of behavior, or the brain was damaged and then personality changed. And to me these seem like two very, very different relations. And I was wondering if one is saying these are the same thing, which to me makes sense, and one is saying personality is an artificial artifact, or not artificial, but is an artifact of the brain.
Okay, good. I'm glad you asked that clarification because I was using a verbal shorthand. So it turns out that when we talk about the brain and the mind being equivalent, what it really is the mind is the algorithm that runs on top of the neural substrate of the brain. And so I was just using a shorthand there, but essentially what happens is when you damage that substrate, that damages, the algorithms go awry, and then that changes things like personality. Does that clarify? Thank you for asking that. There's a question up here.
Are there any special considerations as far as privacy with the advent of new technologies?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, the main thing that we think about every day is how to go about studying this without moving ahead of some sort of moral compass. And one of the things that we care about, and of course the Institutional Review Board cares about a lot, is these issues of privacy. So everything we're doing, that's one of the foremost concerns about it. And but truthfully, it's an open question how that's all going to go. Insurance companies, for example, this has been going on for 20 years. They want people's genetic information. Now, currently they're not going to get it, but boy, they want it. And it would probably be the same in the near future with brain scans and so on, that insurance companies and governments or schools or employers are going to try as much as they can to get that data when it's available. So the community that's researching it is going to just going to have to be very vigilant about keeping privacy. Question here.
I think maybe along a similar lines to what my colleague might have been getting at. Could you speculate for a moment about how this technology might intersect with hate crimes legislation?
Well, for example, the thing that I showed about the implicit association test is the kind of thing where if it's ever going to be allowed into a court, it's probably going to be under the guise of a hate crime trial, where someone says, no, it had nothing to do with I'm not a racist and so on. And if it ever does get accepted, that's where it's going to be. Yeah, that's the only thing. Did you have something in particular in mind?
Well, I think it's along those lines. I mean, yeah, I think I'll just leave it at that.
Okay, yeah. We'll just keep an eye on it. Question here.
Thanks for an excellent presentation. Could you comment on the military implications of this work? And it seems like that there must be an enormous military and intelligence application of it.
There may be someday, but there's not right now. I mean, what the military wants, for instance, is to be able to image people across a room as they're walking through an airport, for example, and know their thoughts. And both of those are completely impossible right now. Long-distance neuroimaging, as well as really knowing anything about somebody's thoughts. So I think the short answer is the military is probably very interested, and they're probably spending money on it, but they're throwing the money away. So that would be my guess on it. Yeah. Yes. Okay.
First of all, I really enjoyed your presentation. It was witty and articulate, and I particularly enjoyed the last silly example of the
Clean Air Act.
Clean Air Act was really, really very interesting, only because it seems like in the 1990s there was a period of prosperity like our country had never enjoyed that also might have some bearing on people taking other people's stuff, you know. But what I'm particularly interested in is your interest in the law. And it seems that when you look at the way that the law is related to science and everything that you would like to see the law encompass is already available in the way the law works today, in the process of the law. Experts get together on both sides. I'm a lawyer, and I practiced law for, since 1987. Spent a little bit of time. I do think that everything that you've argued for is compelling and could persuade a jury and should persuade a jury at times. But there's also, it's never a bright line between the two. And you present things in a way that it makes it seem that there's a black and a white, and sometimes there's just gray. Do you take that into account?
Yeah, I do take it into account. I think I don't agree with you there. The law does like bright line. Here's an example. The recent Supreme Court case is about whether you can execute somebody who committed their crime when they were under 18 or not, or whether you can execute somebody who's mentally retarded or not. Well, in fact, it's a really funny division to say that if you were a day below 18, then you should be treated one way, and a day above 18, you should be treated a different way. That's an example of a bright line. But in fact, we know that the prefrontal cortex, which is what determines your behavior, develops with time. And people develop at different rates. So you have very mature 18-year-olds, very immature 18-year-olds. So it's that kind of bright line which unfortunately jettisons our ability to do anything in a customized fashion. So those are examples of that. And yeah, I mean, I wish there were more.
You don't have a black and white line on when the brain actually changes either.
No, that's exactly it. Because in neuroscience, that's exactly right. In neuroscience, it's all about the gray area. I mean, in science in general, you have a distribution of personality types, distribution of brain development speeds, and so on. And so in neuroscience, we're comfortable living in that gray area. And that's the idea. That's the part that should be taken more into consideration, a more customized view of it. Great. We agree. There's a question up here.
You were talking about the ability or not inability to actually measure things in the brain, and I thought that there was some data that if somebody was, shall we say, an out-and-out sociopath or a psychopath, that is the kind of person that had absolutely no empathy with another person, that you could monitor that activity and difference in the brain. Is that true?
The studies that have been done show that sociopaths have diminished frontal activity. They have slightly lower neural activity. But the problem is we're not actually given, because of the variability in human brains anyway, it doesn't give us any predictive capacity. And so the guy who's done this work, a guy named Adrian Rain, whenever he gives this talk, he says, look, here's what a murderer's brain looks like. And then he shows another brain. He says, what do you think? Does that look more like a normal brain or a murderer's brain? And everyone says, that looks more like the murderer's brain. And it's Adrian's brain. It's the guy who's giving the talk. Right? So it turns out we don't have much predictive capacity from him, even though we know on average that sociopaths have less frontal activity. Question in the back.
Have you faced any blocks in your research, any objections from people who think that this could be abused in an Orwellian capacity if you're predicting people's brains, even though you can't predict yet?
Yeah, that's a great question. There's some degree to which I feel like I'm the biggest block in it because I'm fundamentally libertarian and I don't like the idea of a government being able to look inside your head. There's something really creepy about that, right? So that's why we're trying to go about this extremely carefully. As far as the IRB committee goes and so on, what we're doing is we're working just very carefully to make sure that we cover all those issues. And the goal is not to be able to say, it's not like Minority Report where we tell people, oh, you're going to commit a crime and you're not. It's just that if you believe in the idea of customized sentencing based on probability of recidivism, then it only makes sense to use the best tools you have to say, here's the likelihood. Because remember, it'll do as many people good as it does other people bad. It'll tell us as many people, hey, you know what, this person's really unlikely to commit a crime again. There's no reason to throw him in jail for 10 years or 20 years. The question up here.
Yeah, great talk. I wanted to draw you out a bit on the idea that most of the brain or most of our behavior is automatically driven. Do you think there's any role for consciousness? And could you just talk about how much is automated and how little do we really get to do?
Yeah. The short answer is your conscious brain is like the newspaper headline. So you've got a lot of stuff going on in the brain. Your brain's like the nation, and your conscious is like the newspaper headline. So you've got all this stuff going on in the nation, and factories going, and trains, and cars, and industry. And what happens is that comes up with some sort of result, and then it's like reading USA Today. And that's really all you want. So when I move my arm, it's an unbelievable symphony of neural activity that allows me to do that. But all I get is this sort of mental construct on the top that says, oh, you just did this thing. So that's the situation. And when the conscious mind is involved, it's usually the last guy to hear any information. So we all know the experience of your foot gets halfway to the brake of your car before you're consciously aware that there's somebody pulling out of a driveway in front of you. So consciousness is slow. It doesn't usually have access to most sorts of things. Now, do I believe that it has any function at all? I think it might. I'm sort of a fan of consciousness, but I have to allow that it's getting pushed into a corner. And so that's why I'm proposing this law of sufficient automatism. For the legal system, it might make sense to just leave that part out of it. I mean, when you're looking at a drug addict or even a cigarette addict or an alcoholic, anything like that, they do all sorts of actions that result from part of their brain wanting to do something, but not another part of their brain doing something. And so it's hard to say, well, to what extent are you responsible for it? Because it has to do with this competition going on. That's the idea. Question up here.
In one of your illustrations, you showed the behavior loop. Are we getting into a Lamarckian type of evolution where behavior can become inherited?
It turns out that nowadays there is some evidence for Lamarckian evolution it's what's called epigenetics. And I probably won't have enough time to talk about that here, but we can talk about epigenetics afterwards. But the reason I had that arrow is because depending on your behavior, that's going to influence your reproductive success. So if you do crazy things and you get yourself killed, then you're not passing your genes on. And so that's what I meant by that arrow. The question here.
You just said, I think, that, again, that you find little reason or little room for, say, conscious decision-making, constant choice, that much of it is controlled at levels below consciousness. How does that compare with the older Freudian concept of the dominance of the unconscious?
Yeah, Freud was the first guy to nail this. There were a lot of sort of things that were harbingers of this idea, but Freud was the first one to say, you know what? Most of what's going on in your brain is the part of the iceberg below the surface, and he was totally right about that. So people criticize Freud for all sorts of other details about ideas, but that part of the idea was dead on. A question over here. Where's the microphone? Okay. Is this the last question? Okay, the last question.
Kind of on the same thing about choice. I know you had that kind of timeline where, there was a kind of a distinct line after the steroid guy, but like they chose to ask for more steroids, and like the people that get on drugs, they decide they want to go on drugs, and then if they commit a crime because of that, like how does that really work? Because that was their initial, like I understand if you had a rod in your head, that wasn't really your choice, but then you decide to start taking drugs and then that changes your personality. How can you really, say, well, it's not their fault?
Yeah, you're touching on the complex fabric of human life here, which is that people can start with tiny slippery slopes where they make a small decision about something, and that leads to something much bigger. But remember that the genes that you're predisposed with are something you don't have any choice about, and there are lots of places in life where the line between saying, oh, you actually started that choice somewhere, or saying, actually you didn't really start it, it was started in the womb. We don't exactly know where to draw that and say, okay, well, if you made the first minor step there, then you're responsible. That's why I think, given the complexity of it, that it would be easier just to drop it all together. When a brain is standing in front of the judge's bench and has done something, the judge can't really, it's not his responsibility to say, well, to what extent was it genes and to what extent was it experience? He's just got to deal with the brain that's there and say, you know what, we got to put this brain away for this many years or that many years. That's what I think, and that's why I think it makes more sense to drop that question.
I really hate to stop the questioning because your questions have all been so wonderful, reflecting certainly the kind of exciting and engaging talk that David has given. And I'm sure that I have a lot of company in saying I'm walking out, kind of a different person with a whole set of different ideas than I came in the door today. And that is what we consider to be a great Scientia talk. So let me finish up and before asking you to join me in thanking David by saying we do have a sign-up sheet here for the FMRI visit. So anybody who would like to try to participate in that, please come and sign up. And thank you, David, very much indeed. It's been wonderful. Thank you all for coming.
This program is protected by copyright and may not be redistributed in whole or in part without the express written consent of Rice University Digital Media Services.